All right, well, good morning. It is great to see all of you here today. Man, summer is right here on us. I feel like we just did Easter and summer has just jammed right up here on us. Yeah. And so all kinds of craziness happened. Auburn University's already graduated. They've already done that thing, and many high schools will be graduating this week. We have lots of seniors at this service, many of them sitting right over here. I know that we have several who are also just out there in the audience, and today we're going to have an opportunity to honor them at the end of the service. So we're excited for all that it means for them. Hey, just one more time, next Sunday, 2 services, 9 and 10:30. We're just going to keep pounding that. Because here's the thing, and this will be awesome. If you show up at 11 next week, like that'll be right in the middle of my sermon. So I'm going to take a note of who that is, and I'm going to call you to sit down front, and I'm going to ask you questions. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, so just note the times, 9 and 10:30, and we'll be good to go. So we're going to be recognizing 18 seniors today. And as I was kind of preparing for this message this week, I was just thinking about them and thinking about this step that they're about to take in their life, kind of this movement from home and high school and all things warm and comfy to the world, and all that it has to bring, and taking that next step wherever they're going to go, to school or to work or whatever that may be for them. And oftentimes there's just a big yay, get me out of the house, I'm ready to go. And even with that, though, there can be a little bit of fear, a little bit of apprehension of what it means to let go of one thing and to take hold of something new, something we've never experienced before, gaining some new independence and all that. But there can be some anxiety and apprehension. And those of us who are a little older and wiser, we remember back to that day, when we graduated from high school and what that looked like. And for me, I left the comfort of Montgomery and home and private school to go off 3 hours away to Macon, Georgia, which if you've been to Macon, Georgia in itself is a scary thing. But anyway, going to school there was a whole other issue, and there was a little bit of fear and apprehension. I remember my parents dropped me off and they left, and I went up and got in my dorm room and didn't really know anybody. And I remember thinking, this is not camp. They will not come back in 2 weeks and pick me back up and take me home. This is the real deal. This is where you stay and you grow up and you gain your independence and all this kind of stuff. But that's just the way that is. That's a part of life for sure. And to relate this to kind of a larger picture, anytime any of us go through something new, to take hold of something we've never done before, we look ahead and we don't know what's going to happen in this new job or this new town we're moving to or this new experience that we're having, there can be fear and anxiety and apprehension that goes with that. And even if we're a Christian and we have God with us, we can still feel that sense of, oh no, what's going to happen here? And so today I want to talk about that just a little bit. And we're going to talk about Moses. As we do that, we're going to begin to look at his life today. And if you have your Bibles, we're going to be in 2 different places. Hebrews 11, verse 23. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23. We've been in this monster series called By Faith. We've been in for a long time, looking all the way through Hebrews 11, so we're going to continue to do that today. Also, we're going to be back in the Old Testament like we did last week. We'll be in Exodus chapter 1. So go back there, find your spot, hold on to that, and we'll get to that in just a minute. And last week, we talked a little bit about Joseph and looked at his life, and we're reminded of, first of all, God's influence on him, and then his influence on others in light of what God's grace and mercy and faithfulness meant to him in his life and how important that is. And so today we'll be beginning to look into Moses' life and what God has done for him. So let me read Hebrews 11:23 here, and then we'll kind of get through this. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Okay, so that's a very short verse, and we need to try to figure out what's going on here. And so kind of like last week, we need to unpack this. And really to understand what this verse is talking about, we do need to go back to Exodus chapter 1. So we're going to do that right now. But to catch us all up and where we are at this point in history, so a new king has come to Egypt. A new Pharaoh has come to power. So the old Pharaoh that Joseph worked with and was so close with is gone now. Joseph and his brothers have died, and this new Pharaoh has come to power who didn't know Joseph and who really doesn't have any concern for the Israelites. And so the Israelites are enslaved by the Egyptians, and they have begun to multiply rapidly over the last couple of years. And that's one thing that the Pharaoh notices is how large that group of Israelites is becoming, and they begin to get very concerned about that. They're concerned about their own power. They're concerned they may outnumber the Egyptians. And so the Pharaoh decides to institute several policies to curb that. And one of them is he decides that every male Hebrew baby should be killed. And that was one way, obviously, to control that population. So he calls together all the midwives. There were lots of Egyptian midwives who helped birth Hebrew babies. And so he calls all these midwives together, and he tells them about this edict that he's passing. And he commands them, he says, listen, when you're there and you're helping them give birth to these babies, if it's a male baby, kill it. And so they were sent away with this command. And so what we're picking up here in Exodus 1:17 is what happens after they go away from this meeting with Pharaoh. So it says here, the midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was, they were vigorous, okay. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Now, this is a pretty extraordinary thing that's happening here. Understand, again, these were Egyptian midwives. They would have worshiped whatever pagan gods the Egyptians were worshiping in that day. But something had happened to this group. Maybe it was through their connection to the Hebrew women, but they had discovered a faith in them that impressed them so much so that they feared and respected their God, our God. And so when he told them to go and kill these babies, they knew that was wrong. And they decided to put their trust in God for the outcome of this, knowing that, when you disobey the command of the Pharaoh, it's likely you're not going to survive that. But instead, they give their faith to God, they trust him, and the outcome goes well for them. God watches over them, actually gives them families and all these things that maybe they wouldn't normally have. And so it's an extraordinary story of faith happening here before Moses even comes onto the scene, but it's important to set a foundation of what else will happen. So we go over to Exodus chapter 2, verse 1. This is where Moses will come into the picture. It says, now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. Okay, so the child is Moses, obviously, that's born here, and you probably heard that story of putting him in the basket in the river. His parents, his dad, is named Amram, which is kind of like Bob or Joe. Amram, great names back then. So Amram was his dad from the line of Jacob. And Amram's wife, Moses' mother, was named Jochebed, naturally, like Ann and Susan and Julie, Jochebed. So, and they had actually had 3 children, Miriam, Moses' older sister, and Aaron, Moses' older brother, and then now Moses. So Moses is born during the time of the Pharaoh's edict to have all these babies killed. So that's why when Moses was born, Jochebed took him and hid him for 3 months to not let anybody know what had happened, that she had this son. But obviously, we can surmise at some point there was some pressure put on her. In other words, it's likely that somebody found out that she had this son, and one of the Egyptians was going to come and take care of that. So she was faced with this terrible decision. If I keep Moses, it's likely they're going to find him and they're going to kill him. I have to do something to save his life. And so she does this drastic thing where she makes this basket and puts this pitch and tar on it because she wants to put it in the water, and she puts it at the river's edge in the reeds, it says. And she puts Moses, her son, imagine, moms, putting your baby son in that basket and then walking off and leaving him there because that's the only option you have, hoping that something good will happen. She already knew this child was different. She already knew that there was something about him, that God had done something to this child and that he had favor on him. And so she puts it in the basket, and probably what she's hoping, based on where she put it on this edge of the river, is that somebody, maybe from Pharaoh's household would come find him and have mercy on him and let him live. And if you fast forward, we know that that is eventually what will happen. But at this moment, what we're getting is a mom who, with great fear and apprehension, yet trusts God, puts him in this basket, hopes that God will preserve him and keep him. And those midwives who trusted God, a God that they had adopted, more or less, against Pharaoh. And so there's lots of things that we learn from just these passages and these stories. And so a couple of things that I think are important takeaways for us is, first of all, that faith overcomes fear. And that's something that we've probably heard more times than we can count. It's something that we know in our heart, but how often do we live it out when we're in the middle of whatever it is that's causing us great fear? Faith is designed in such a way that it overcomes whatever fear we face, because what we have in us, by the nature of being a Christian, is the Spirit of Jesus Christ. The Spirit of the living God in us that helps us live this life and overcome fear. Now, fear is a powerful emotion. Would you agree with me on that? I mean, fear makes us do crazy things. Have you ever been locked up with fear, like to where you didn't think you could make a decision, that kind of thing? I remember when I was 15 years old, some of you have heard me tell this story, but my dad took me out to Montana to go elk hunting. He and several customers, and so we go out there, and I was excited about this trip, and I was also scared to death because I had read all these articles about bears attacking people out in this part of the world. So that's pretty much all that was in my mind. So we get out there. The second day out, they had decided I was going to hunt by myself instead of hunting with a guide. And I was kind of like, hey, I don't know if I want to do that. I don't know. I'm still thinking about the bears. The articles are coming, and everything. So anyway, the next day, we get up, ride the horses up on this big ridge, and they drop me off by myself, 15 years old, out there in the wilderness with the bears. And I'm supposed to hunt, like that's the whole object here. But I'll be honest with you, the minute they got out of sight, I was in survival mode. I just wanted to get back to the tent. I didn't really care about shooting anything. And so I'm standing there, and the guide said, these guides were just like, they had no sensitivity, none whatsoever. They were just like, okay, so just go that way and you'll hit a trail, see it. And they took off, So I was like, go that way. Go which way? What did you say? And just go down, and he'll hit the trail, and it'll take you back to the tent. So I was like, all right, so I'll do that. So I start going down, but in the mountains, there's this crazy thing that going down, and then you go up. And then you go down again, then you go up. And after a while, you get disoriented. And so after about the second up, which was only about 200 yards away, really, I was completely disoriented and afraid. I'm lost. Somebody help me. Oh, my gosh. And so I started freaking out. And so I walk through the woods, and I get to this meadow, and it opens up, and I'm standing there, and all of a sudden, I hear something. I hear this, this raking sound and this breathing sound, and it's about 100 yards across this meadow down to this tree line. It's happening down the tree line. I'm like, oh, my gosh. I knew it. It's a bear. I'm going to die. It's going to happen. They're going to write about me in an article, And so I'm sitting there, and this is the moment where I've been gripped with fear. I'll never forget it. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether I should go because he'll hunt me down. That's what bears do. They can smell you 4 million miles away. They will find you. There's no way to get away from them. So if I go, maybe if I just stay here, there was a big boulder. If I sit on this rock, he'll just decide to go away, So anyway, so I sit on the boulder. I'm hoping he'll go away. And it was only 10 minutes, but it seemed like forever. So I'm sitting there, and then this noise kept happening, but nothing else was happening. And I was like, what's going on here? So I pull up my binoculars, and I'm looking down in there, and I'm like, those aren't bear legs. What is that? And I'm looking, and then I see a horse head. And it was one of the horses that we had rode up on. They had let it go down there in the woods, and he was raking on a tree and snorting and stuff. And we almost lost a horse at that moment. I was like, dadgummit, you had me sitting here scared to death. So anyway, I was still lost, though. I was alive, but I was lost, and there's still a bear somewhere out there. So I start going, and I find one of the other hunters, and it was actually one of the pilots. I saw his orange vest, and so I go running over to him. And he's like, whoa, what are you doing? Are you okay? And I was like, oh, my gosh, I am going to live. Thank you for being here. And he's like, what is your problem? I'm like, I've been lost. I thought I heard a bear. And he's like, okay, just calm down. The trail's right down there. And I was like, okay, the last time somebody did that, I couldn't find it. So exactly where is the trail? And so I go down there, I hit the trail, I go back to camp. Oh, that was rough. Anyway, and so that feeling that I had, that moment where I'm like, I'm in this moment, fear is happening to me, God, you're going to have to come and do something, is a moment that may be common to some of us. And if we haven't experienced fear in that way, we may experience it, in our lifetime, a point at which we're like, what do I do with this? Because fear has this crazy thing that it does to us, and it can cause havoc in our life. I was reading an article this past week in USA Today, and they were talking about the issue of fear, but they were relating it also to this issue of anger. And they were talking about the anger issue that we have in this country. And I thought it was interesting. They said that the amount of Americans who report feeling angry or irritable on any given day went from 50% 2 years ago to 60% today. And what they're saying is that for whatever reason, anger is becoming this issue among us as Americans. They may attribute it to the economy, to our financial situation, to the loss of job, lots of things that are going on these days. And then attached to this was a study that Harvard came up with back in 2012, and they talked about the fact that nearly 2/3 of American teens admit to having anger attacks involving the destruction of property, threats of violence, or engaging in violence. It's like even among our teenagers, this anger thing is already happening. And then yesterday, I heard this thing on the radio. It's like, I don't know where this is coming at me from all sides. And they were talking about road rage. Now, none of you have ever been involved in road rage or ever thought about road rage or any of this. So we'll talk about other people with this. But they were talking about this whole issue in this country of how that is on the rise. And, of course, it mostly happens in major cities. We don't really see it much in Lochapoka. It's not a lot of road rage happening out there. But they were giving us these 3 indicators. One is how many people ride other people's bumpers. And then maybe give them a little love tap. Maybe possibly shove them into the next person, Like, these are indicators of road rage. Another one is the honking. How many people doing the honking out there on the road? And then there's another road rage sign that people can often give. That's like, hey, I'm number 1. And you're number 1. And I love you. So excited we're driving together today. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. So anyway, so there's this issue of road rage. By the way, you know what the number 1 city in America is with the largest incidence of road rage? Take a guess. Auburn, Alabama. No, I'm just kidding. It's really not. It's Lochapoka. No, that's okay. No, it's not Atlanta. Houston, Texas. Yeah, and I thought it'd be L.A. because isn't that where all the stuff happens? But anyway, so anybody from Houston? Anybody ever lived in Houston? We got one over here. You okay? Are you angry? You're okay. You look okay. All right, I think we're going to be fine. Anyway, so if you go to Houston, just know that's what you're getting into when you drive there. But all right, so the anger was not the whole point here. So it did say that America has an anger epidemic. That is something we should all deal with. But here's the thing. They said that one of the seeds of anger is fear. Fear of lots of different things, for sure. Fear of losing our job, fear of our finances going collapsing, all those kinds of things. But one thing they said was just fear of other people has become very prominent these days. Fear of people, what they may say or what they may do. So in the article it said, for 4 decades, a gut-level ingredient of democracy, trust in the other fellow, has been quietly draining away. These days, only 1/3 of Americans say that most people can be trusted. Half felt that way in 1972. 40 years later, a record high of nearly 2/3 say you can't be too careful in dealing with people. So we've sort of developed this fear of people, what they may do to us, what they may say, what will happen here, and I don't know, I think about that and I go back to those midwives who stood up against the Pharaoh and who said, you know what? We believe in the power and authority of God over your power and authority. And against the threat of death, we will trust God and we will not obey you. We will do the right thing. And then I think about what David wrote in Psalm 27:1 when he said this, the Lord is my light and my salvation. What's that? Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? In other words, I have the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. I have the God of creation on my side who said he'd be with me and stand with me through everything. What am I so afraid of? Who can measure up against him? Who is stronger than my God? Nobody. Nobody. No thing can overwhelm God. And he is with us and he is for us. And it is our faith that helps us overcome our fear, whatever that may be. And then there's this other thing closely related to it, that faith leads to courage. Courage is a tool that God gives us to overcome fear. Courage is something that we all need to do this life. And courage is something, again, that God has given us through his Spirit. Courage helps us face the unknown. And, again, back to these seniors, all of you seniors out here who will go on and take your next step in life, this is a tough world that you're being graduated into. And I know that every generation says this about the previous generation, but some of you would agree with me. This is a different world that they're stepping into than the one you and I graduated into years ago. Would you agree with me on that one? So many things have changed, and they're changing more rapidly. And morally, it's just a different culture that we're living in these days. And they're going to be faced with tests of their faith and pressure and difficulty. That will happen. That's just the way that is. But I think about, again, this thing that God has given you and all of us called courage. The ability to go out and do the right thing. I read a quote this past week, actually, a couple of them I thought were good. Nelson Mandela said, "I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear." It's like we know that fear will happen, it will come, but what we do with it is what really matters. If we take the courage and overcome it. And then there's the poet, John Wayne. You know this poet? He said, "Courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway." Yeah, you're going to be scared to death, but go ahead and do it anyway. Go for it. I'm reminded we have this one life to live. God has given us this one opportunity to go for it, to make a difference in this world. And he's given us a way to do that, to be strong and courageous, to not give up. A couple of years ago, I was in a Bible study with some men, and we were talking about this whole issue of courage and all that. And somebody brought up this idea of the dog soldiers. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. Part of the Cheyenne Indian Nation. There's a group of warriors called the Dog Soldiers, and they started talking about it. It just came to mind this week as I was thinking about this. And I went back and kind of reread what that was all about. And Cheyenne Nation was a very, very proud nation, and dog warriors were just fierce warriors. And it said that they were the modern Spartans who knew how to fight, knew how to die, and would never be taken captive. And you read a little bit more about that, and you discover what these warriors would do was very interesting. As they were preparing to go to battle, if they were defending their territory, each individual soldier would get a plot of ground, and they would declare that their plot of ground. And they would take this thing called a picket pin. And a picket pin was something they normally would drive in the ground and tie a rope to it for their horses. But they would pull up a picket pin, and they would take it with them, and they would get to their plot of ground, and they would drive that stake in the ground, and they would take a dog rope, is what it was called, and they would tie it to the pin, and they would tie it to their ankle. And basically the idea was that they were going to stay there, and they were going to fight either until they won or until they died. These were some of the most courageous warriors you could ever imagine. But the interesting thing was, it's not that they were fighting just for that piece of ground. They were fighting for their families. They were fighting for what they believed in. They were fighting for their children's future. They were fighting for honor for their people. These were the things that actually welled up in them that caused them to stay on that piece of ground and not give it up. And I think in the day that we live in, as we're carrying out our faith, that maybe in some places we need to learn how to be courageous enough to stick our stake in the ground and declare this place God's. Declare our marriage God's, how we handle people at work, what we do with our families, how we treat other people. All these things, these places that we commit to, that we drive a stake in the ground. We say, God, I give you this, my life, and I will not move from it. And I will take the courage that you've given me, and I will do whatever you call me to do, because I believe your power and authority are greater than anything else in this life. And you know, Moses later on in his life would do some very courageous things. One of them was that he would lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And in that process, he would have to take them across the Jordan River and take hold of the promised land. The only thing that stood between them and the promised land were 31 pagan nations they would have to conquer in order to do that. And so before they crossed the Jordan River, in Deuteronomy 31:6, Moses tells his people, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous. Do not be overwhelmed by fear. For I am with you, and my promise to you is that I will never leave you nor forsake you. Now, how important is that for us? We need his courage. And we need our faith. And we need his presence in our life for everything that we do. You agree with me? Let's pray. God, we thank you so much for the reminder today. First of all, that you are faithful. That you never leave, you never go away, you never get tired. You are the rock that never moves, and you've told us, I will be with you. And Lord, all of us need to hear those words. Be strong and courageous. Do not be overcome by fear. Do not be overcome by discouragement. Be strong and courageous in whatever you face. And God, I know that surely there are some who've come this morning who are facing difficult circumstances. Maybe who've been gripped by fear and aren't sure where to go or what to do. Lord, I pray that they would look up to you today, right now. And they would know there is a God who is with them. And we thank you for that. God, we thank you that you have made this possible through the gift of your Son, Jesus Christ, through his death on the cross, overcoming sin, by being raised again and overcoming death. And that his Spirit lives in us. And in your word it says we do not have a spirit of timidity or fear, but of power and self-confidence. So God, help us just to own that Spirit that lives in us and go through this life in that way, trusting you and being confident in you and resting in you for everything and having faith that you've already gone ahead of us. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.